Poland is challenging the European identity, and it's creating tension between Poland and the EU. The biggest voice in the EU is Germany, and in particular, Chancellor Merkel. They've been voicing a lot of, let's say, negative things about Poland, particularly as it applies to Poland's policy on migration and Muslims who are coming up from the Middle East through Europe and into Germany. To address all of these issues is Dr. George Friedman. He's in Warsaw, Poland right now. Dr. Friedman, thanks so much for joining me. You've recently written that Poland and Hungary present mortal challenges for the EU. Why don't you unpack that idea for me?
Well, begin with this. The EU has a view of what liberal democracy is. Not officially, not written down, but deep in its culture. And they expect all members of the European Union to abide by that. The Hungarians and the Poles in particular have exercised a somewhat different view. And that view revolves around this principle. The fundamental principle of liberal democracy is and ought to be national self-determination. If you don't have that, no other right is meaningful. Their view is that their governments have been elected by very large majorities, and therefore they are going to make the decisions about the future of their country. One of the issues, a major issue, is an insistence by the Europeans that all countries accept a certain number of Muslim immigrants. The EU has somewhat modified that demand, but still the Poles particularly have rejected it. Their claim is they have the right to determine who immigrates to Poland, and they object to the Muslims coming to Poland primarily because they don't fit into Polish society. They have a vision of what Poland should be like. It's a historical vision, and they don't want to transform it. The EU has a very different view, which is that national identity is something that is a problem, that if you have too strong a national identity, then you're excluding others in the EU and outside of EU. And this is a real showdown, because the Poles are not going to give on this issue, and the European Union really can't capitulate on this issue because it's core to both of them. And so we're in a showdown. And if the Poles get away with it, so to speak, and Hungarians get away with it as well, and the British are leaving the EU somewhat on the same issue, because Brexit was not about economics. It was about national self-determination for the British, and to a very large extent, and the migration issue as well. If they can't get away from this, the EU is going to get whittled away. And that's what we're really seeing. It's being slowly whittled away. It asserts itself. It becomes more demanding on member countries. It picks fights with some of them, and it keeps getting pressed in. You talk to the EU representatives here at this conference I'm attending, and they're very confident, and they're very certain that in the end they will prevail. But when you talk to the Poles, they're very confident that it's not going to be any capitulation on their part, not so long as this particular party is in power.
Well, the Catholic Church still plays a prominent role in public life in Poland today. Obviously, the EU is a completely secular organization in terms of how it looks at the world. How is that tension, how is that going to be resolved? Because obviously that does play into what's happening here with this Muslim migration as well.
Well, the EU's view of religion is that it's a private matter. Everyone is welcome to practice whatever religion they want, but it cannot enter the public sphere. In Poland, the Catholic Church played a pivotal role in the fall of communism. The Polish Church provided much of the energy, much of the organization, much of the money that helped Solidarity push the Soviets back against the wall. So we are in a situation where the Poles see the Catholic Church as an integral part of their society. And on the other side of the equation, the EU is very uncomfortable with that. It's just another part of the very different view of the world. But really the problem is that Europe is a very different place. It has many countries. in a very small place. They view the world differently. And at this point, a lot of them are challenging the EU's point of view. And the EU Secretariat in particular is becoming more and more assertive. I don't think we're at a point of anything breaking down, but we are certainly in a confrontation between some important countries and the EU.
Okay, so then, based off that, then, what can the EU actually do to Poland? To what degree can they hurt the Polish economy, for instance?
They provide a certain amount of money to Poland. It's not insignificant. It's not determinate. They could cut that money off. If they did that, Poland's reason for obeying would disappear altogether. And then the question is, who else do they cut off from this money? So that would be the extreme thing they could do. In the meantime, they can do things such as banning Poland from having a vote in important matters, which I don't think would be that critical. And beyond that, there's very little they can do. They could, for example, throw them out of the free trade zone. But if they started doing that to countries, Germany in particular would be appalled because they really need these countries to be buying their products. So they're kind of boxed in. And the more boxed in they are, the more intense the statements coming out of Brussels are, and the more adamant the Poles become.
Now, the other issue that's happening right now is that Poland's right-leaning government is trying to place its own allies within key positions in the government, its ideological allies, and there's a lot of pushback from both the EU and inside Poland. What's happening there?
Well, one question is the question of the judiciary. Another question is the question of the media. A good deal of these people were appointed by prior governments. They are hostile to this government. Many don't make any bones about it. This government's position is, we were elected, we must control the instruments of the state. Now, the Constitution makes it very difficult to remove justices. But I'm reminded of the fact that Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the U.S. Supreme Court by expanding its size and filling it with his own supporters. He lost, but if he had succeeded, I don't think we would call him an enemy of liberal democracy, just a shrewd politician. The question, of course, of public broadcasting everywhere is, okay, if it is truly independent, then why is the government supporting it in this age? And if the government is going to support it, why shouldn't it be responsive to the will of the people who elected this government? So the argument goes back and forth. The important thing is that the EU has inserted itself in what is fundamentally a domestic political issue by claiming that what the Poles are doing is not just unacceptable to Poland, but unacceptable to the EU. That's now coming to the point where the EU not only wants national self-determination, but it wants national self-determination to run in a direction that it's comfortable with. There are a lot of ways to organize a liberal democracy. And the Polish way is one way and is not necessarily completely anathema. And the EU is saying that these issues within Poland actually violate not only liberal democracy, but the rules of the EU. So you have the situation at a time when they're negotiating Britain's exit, that they're turning on Poland and Hungary about their internal political affairs. And this really creates a question. Are these countries independent countries who happen to be in a treaty relationship with the EU? Or are they states under the control of the EU? And that is highly ambiguous in terms of the Maastricht Treaty says. That's the treaty that organized the EU, and very dubious from the point of view of many Europeans. And some see this as really a German power play to try to get all of Europe lined up at its side. That's the most extreme view. But what you're having here is the EU not only responding to the British leaving the EU with hostile words, but becoming hostile to other countries as well. At a certain point, this is going to reach a critical mass, and there'll be a confrontation even greater than this.
Well, obviously, we've already seen that happen in Germany here with the elections, and the far right gaining, something like 12% of the vote, which is, from the rest of the world's perspective, quite surprising, maybe. Now, another question for you, two final ones. But first off, still as we address this issue as it pertains to Poland vis-a-vis the EU. Now, obviously, Hungary has I don't want to call him a scapegoat, but they have certainly used George Soros, financier George Soros, as a foil in this argument against the EU to its own people. How is Poland presenting, the Polish government, how are they presenting this argument to their own people about what's going on?
Well, they're fairly forthright in making the claims as I kind of described them. And this government is still quite popular. It won with a very large majority. The people are behind it. I mean, the Polish public, not by any means all of them, it's a strong minority on the other side, but the Polish public is not at all happy with the prior governments that were in place. And they see the EU action kind of trying to be to restore a moderate left government in Poland. And they're looking at the EU as trying to manipulate the political system. Now, those who oppose the current government see the EU as trying to guarantee democracy that this government, they argue, is violating. But under any circumstances, you now see the EU taking sides within the internal affairs of a country, which takes us to a different place.
Okay, final question for you then. Obviously, Poland has deep historical suspicion of both Germany and Russia, given that they're sandwiched in between the two and based off what happened on September the 1st, 1939, when both countries invaded Poland to start off World War II. So my question is, this obviously brings in the United States into this question. How does the U.S. view this issue between Poland and the EU, and obviously the security issues that come into play vis-a-vis Poland and Russia?
The United States is really not that interested in the EU. The EU would like them to think that the United States thinks about them, is worried about them. But the institution the United States is concerned about is NATO. And the United States still has an overriding concern with the Russians. I don't think the Russians are in any position to attack, but the United States has entered into a very strong military relationship with Poland. That's technically part of NATO, but really is not something Germany is very happy with. From the American point of view, there is no military problem with Germany, but relations aren't particularly good and haven't been good for quite a while. There is a threat from Russia, and we see, the United States sees Poland as a major strategic asset, and the Poles see the Americans as the major ally. So the U.S. is obviously going to stay out of this dispute over the EU's relationship to Poland. But it has its own relationship. It's very strong. And when you talk here to people in the military and outside, you really get an understanding of just how much this relationship has developed. Poland is a strong United States ally, is quite wary of Germany, and very hostile to Russia.
Well, we'll be watching to see what happens, Dr. Friedman. Thanks so much for your time.
Take care.